let's start with like, what is data? This is not a given, not something that everybody agrees on. I'm going to touch on a couple of strands of thinking that I find particularly useful. One of them comes from one of my teachers at the University of Virginia, who now is a professor at UCLA, Johanna Drucker, co-author of a book called The Digital Humanities, sort of a point of reference in the larger world, digital humanities at large, somebody who's worked in textual scholarship and media theory for decades. And she came up with the concept of CAPTA, to point out that everything that we call data is something that has already been interpreted, something that has already gone through a hermeneutic process. So she says it's not data because it's not something that was given to us. It is CAPTA in the sense that it was something that was already captured. It was something that was already extracted and by humans, implying that there was already an interpretive move in order to before it's given to us. This is, of course, a response to the scientificist sort of tendencies that we have today in our data-driven society, when decision makers, administrators, and the like, of course, insist that they make decisions based on data, right? And as if somehow interpretation is removed, and somehow gives them a level of objectivity, right? So Johanna is reacting to this. Obviously, I'm not an anti-empiricist myself, but this kind of critique is very important at the beginning. Okay, so what is this thing that we capture and that becomes what people refer to as data? What is this CAPTA? For us today in this call, it's going to be collections and documents. And I'll reference other things that are not collections and documents as I go along. But as we capture these things and digitize them, they go through this process of interpretation, which implies curation, which implies transformation, repetition with a difference that is familiar to editors, etc. We still don't say it's data until we are able to do certain things to it. So this is the second strand of thinking that will help us understand what we mean by data. It is in order for it to really count as data, to convince others that we're really talking about data. It seems to me, there is no name that I can associate with this strand of thinking, but I know it's very common in my neighborhood. It seems to me that you must be able to do certain things with these objects before they can be data. So it's not only this transformation from the analog to the digital that goes through an interpretive process that turns something into data. It is also your ability to be able to perform certain moves on these objects. I think that is in fact the key definition for the most useful definition for us today in these 2 hours. So when we're talking about collections and documents in particular. And I say computational moves because the type of stuff that we want to do is the type of stuff that's driven by software, that's driven by scripts that we write, that's driven by code rather than by us. The clearest way to explain this is by showing you the Digital Library of the Caribbean on the front interface. And I'm going to share my screen. So in the back end, obviously, there's a lot of data. But for you, outside of the staff, outside of the institutions that have access to this data, this is what you see. And I am a researcher of MSSR, so I am going to just look for some of the things associated with him. So there's a conférence de presse with Leopold Sangor. When I arrive in this page, I can download one item at a time. Actually, this is not a great example because this doesn't even show me. Let me see here. This is a great one. This is the more typical of the digital library algorithm. So there's this book. I arrive at this book, Enemies of Empire. It's been digitized. And I can start reading it. So the moves that I'm able to make here are like, I'm able to browse. Well, first I searched, I'm able to browse, and then I arrive at an item that I can read. These moves still don't make this data to me. They still keep it at the level of media to me. They keep it at the level where the only move that I can make is to read. The only thing that I can do right now is it's just experience. It's not even the whole book. Apparently, I can only see the first and the last page. So this is very limited in terms of what I can do with it. For those of you who were here with Schuyler Spree, she probably showed you Voyant. When we say that we can make computational moves on objects or a collection of objects, what we mean is that we can do the types of things that Voyant does. We can perform text analysis. Now, I want you to think for a second about this, like, what do you do with all these digital collections that you spend your time with? You browse, you search, you find the objects you're looking for. Sometimes you can download them and read them on your Kindle. Sometimes you can just read them right there on the browser. Sometimes you're looking at a picture, sometimes you're looking at a movie. You browse, you search, you find the object, you experience it. Now, most of these collections have the same kind of Platonic form, which you just saw. Search, browse. There's a search function, there's a browse function. There's an item view where you see the item. We just saw it, right? Now, this is not only tied to digital collections. A lot of the internet is organized like this. So you could think, for example, of JSTOR as participating in the same architecture. And you can also think of Google Books as participating in the same architecture, or HathiTrust. Now, I'm going to use the example of Google Books to show you then what happens between this transition of like experiencing these objects one by one to being able to manipulate them computationally by showing you Google's own n-gram viewer based on their Google Books collection. I'm going to share my screen again, and this should make the idea clear for you. So I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to look for the Google n-gram viewer. Here it is. Now, Google Books has, I don't know how many millions books already digitized from the library, from my library at Columbia, from Harvard, Michigan, I think, Princeton, a couple others. Anyways, they have so many books, and they started making, and they made a deal a decade ago with publishers. So they now that new books that come out, they digitize them, right? In any case, all of these things can be experienced one by one, but you can also start now making computational moves. You can start, for example, counting words throughout the whole collection. So this example, the first one that comes in is one that searches and compares the appearances in books from 1800 until 2000 of the words Albert Einstein, Sherlock Holmes, and Frankenstein. It's kind of like a little fun thing where you can see that Frankenstein, obviously, in the beginning, there is no Sherlock Holmes and no Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein appears in the 1920s, right? And obviously, Sherlock Holmes appears in the late 19th century. But then you see them competing in the 20th century. This was not done by hand. Somebody did not sit down to count every time the word Frankenstein, Sherlock Holmes, and Albert Einstein appeared in Google Books. This was done probably with Python or Ruby or one of these programming languages, and with the data available, they were able to crawl throughout this vast collections of millions of books in order to be able to draw these points, in order to be able to draw these lines. So when we say collections as data, or even when we say data in our world, the humanities, what we mean is the artifacts in such a shape that we can perform these operations on. So for the artifacts to be amenable to these forms of operations. So there's two ways to understand data as we made it, to recap. Data at the beginning let us understand it as this process of capturing bits of reality and somehow converting them into the digital world through some kind of process, through photography, through transcription manually, et cetera, et cetera. In all cases, we're talking about a process that has interpretation built in from the beginning. And secondly, what we mean by data is also at the end, these objects in a way that we're able to manipulate them computationally, that we're able to extract ourselves, to set little machines in motion that can produce new cultural artifacts, in this case, a visualization based on the data.